Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Trevor Mundel. Trevor's president of Gates Global Health and oversees all of the efforts at the Gates Foundation in new medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics. I've known Trevor for probably 15 years since he was head of global development at Novartis during probably what was one of the most productive periods in the development of new medicines in recent history in the pharmaceutical industry. And then from Novartis, Trevor has gone to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Trevor not only has an MD, but he actually has a PhD in mathematics. And despite that, Trevor is not a very theoretical person in his approach towards new medicines for infectious disease. He's very practically oriented in nuts and bolts. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Trevor, and Trevor is going to give us some insights into the COVID pandemic. Trevor?
Thanks very much, Pete, and it's great to be able to chat to you again and to the group here. We were together, I think it was 2 years ago, 2019, before all of this started, and we had a good discussion then. And now I can hopefully give you a little bit of a view from the front lines. And the front lines, surprising to me now, are as well in La Jolla and San Diego and San Francisco and Seattle. But the front lines that I'll be talking about are more in other places, Africa, South Asia. Scripps has been a great partner for us because of the quality of the science there. And I do want to call out, at least one aspect of our collaboration, which has been pretty extensive, from HIV, structural biology, many different areas. But, one of the key projects that we've had over the last couple of years has been establishing a repurposing drug library with Scripps, which contains about 14,000 compounds, which I think is the best annotated repurposed library out there. And it's been made available during COVID to not-for-profit organizations across the globe. It's been a very important part of the drug discovery and the repurposing in this pandemic. And I think it's going to play an increasingly significant role, and we'll get a little bit to that. Now, as much as we've worked a lot on drug discovery, I'm going to talk mostly about vaccines. And I'm going to talk about vaccines because they really have turned out to be the potential solution at the end of the day, other than the non-pharmaceutical interventions, which have also been significant. But vaccines are really where we're going to be able to end this problem. But I do think that the vaccines have kicked up opportunities where drugs are still going to be very important. And they've also defined the parameters around, in order to be useful, what are the accelerations that we need in the whole drug discovery process, and what preparatory work do we need so that we'd be in place to do that. So hopefully you'll get a sense of that from this. Of course, we see the numbers, and every place on the earth has been touched by this pandemic. The numbers, of course, are vast underestimates. When we look at the real numbers, ultimately we'll see that deaths and cases will be a lot higher, particularly in places where they're not being well measured. So if you take Zambia, a couple of months ago, it was said that there was minimal COVID in Zambia. And we funded a sampling survey of the central morgue in Lusaka. And when they sampled the deceased persons there, 20% of them were positive for COVID. So we can imagine that there was a raging COVID outbreak that was not being measured at all. So these numbers are going to underestimate things. In contrast to the pandemic touching every part of the world, let's just look through the sequence over here of the distribution of vaccines. And as we play this out through to almost present time, the troubling and really disturbing fact to me is you see that there's a part of the world that is really being left out in this early distribution of vaccines. That's in Africa, and you can see a little bit in South and Central Asia as well, where there's been minimal distribution of vaccines, probably certainly less than 10 million at this point, and probably substantially less than that. Now, that problem is going to go away as we move into 2022, when there will be literally billions of doses available, I think. But the equity basis of this, because this delay equals a lot of disruption and a lot of unfortunate consequences in the countries that are impacted. And it's not because resources are not available to buy the vaccines. It's just that the supply has been utilized in many bilateral agreements, and it's just not available. So this is the situation which we are looking to correct and to change. And one of the reasons, even if you would not be motivated by the moral imperative to have equity in the distribution of vaccines, then there's a very strong argument to be made in terms of the development of the variants of the COVID-19. The first one which came to light was the 117 mutation set in the UK, which raged through that country and is now on the uptick in the US. It may well be the cause that the decline in infections and deaths in the US, which has been quite dramatic, will actually tailor off in March and April with the rise of this variant. The variant that I'm most concerned about is this South African variant, which has a number of mutations, particularly in this receptor binding domain. And this seems to have originated in the Eastern Cape region of South Africa. And you'll see, why that is significant in a couple of slides. But the real problem with this variant is that if you take convalescent plasma from people who recovered from the original coronavirus infection, it is really quite inactive against this new variant. And this seems to have the possibility to reinfect people. Now, we don't know the reinfected people, do they have less severe disease? But that problem alone of this ability of it to potentially reinfect people who've already been infected by the original coronavirus strain sets up a lot of problems for us. And we'll talk a little bit also about the vaccines. A somewhat similar set of mutations and strain has arisen in Brazil. And initially it was confined to the Amazon region in Brazil, but now is spreading quite widely through the country. It has a little bit of different properties to the South African variant. So we have to see how this variant, the P1 variant, as people call it, is going to play out. These variants really have a big impact on the vaccines. So we've had data. It was fortunate that we were able to fund some studies in South Africa, two of the important studies. And there was a third one done by Johnson & Johnson. But the studies of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and the Novavax vaccine were two studies that the foundation had funded because we were really intent that vaccine development, clinical trials also be done in Africa. And those studies, because they started at the time when the variants were starting to surge in the country, captured a lot of the activity of these vaccines against the variants. And as we've seen, the activity of Novavax, which is a highly potent vaccine, was reduced to about 50% against symptomatic disease. And we have to see how it works against more severe disease. I think it looks hopeful that it would still be highly protective against severe disease. For the J&J vaccine, somewhat similar. It had attenuated efficacy against just any infections, but seemed to still be active against severe disease. And you probably would project that similar might be true for the other potent vaccines like the Moderna, Pfizer, mRNA vaccines. The AstraZeneca viral vectored vaccine, on the other hand, had really almost no activity against symptomatic disease. And we don't have the data yet against the more severe disease, although we could hope it might still have some activity over there. And there are studies underway to look at that. But that's important because the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine is the vaccine which initially is most available to us to distribute to Africa and to other regions, other lower middle income countries. This ability of this coronavirus to mutate to this extent, I think, has surprised people. Individually, the virus seems to have a fairly slow mutation rate. So to accumulate 30 mutations, there's a real question as to how exactly that has happened. And we'll talk about at least one theory. But this does set up the possibility. And I think it's slight right now because it looks like the current vaccines that we have are going to be good enough, certainly against severe disease, They may need to be adapted, but fortunately, the mRNA vaccines are readily adapted, and we already have clinical trials, early stage clinical trials with adapted mRNA vaccines. Two of the companies have already initiated that. So we would be able to adapt it, but one shouldn't believe that that's an easy process, because to scale up once again that adaptation would mean cannibalizing the current production, which we need in order to get the vaccine out there. So it's a very tricky balance there between adapting quickly and maintaining supply of the existing vaccine. So if the existing vaccine is good enough, there's a propensity to want to continue to deploy that. Well, the one lesson that we have from these variants is that it's just not a tenable position to think that we'll live within our boundaries, we'll live within our homes, and what happens at other parts of the globe, it's sad, but it doesn't really make a difference to us, because that's what's happened. These variants have arisen to allow this virus to actually transmit in large human populations without any interruption. Is just a recipe for the disaster that might befall us if, in fact, we see even more significant mutations, with the prospect even that it may outrun our ability to develop vaccines. That's not in prospect right now, but it's something that we need to think about as nightmare kind of scenario and plan for that. And maybe drugs have got their place over there. Well, what about the other silent epidemics that have somewhat been forgotten for many years and now maybe even less in people's minds? There is the HIV epidemic in Southern and East Africa in particular, which has continued to track along, I would say, with progress in terms of putting people on antiretrovirals. But in terms of the actual numbers of infected individuals, has only worsened, in fact. And the compliance issues of keeping people chronically on drugs are such that, it says here 71% of adults are on antiretrovirals, but the number that are effectively, consistently suppressed would be probably substantially less than that. One of the regions that has a high prevalence in South Africa is this Eastern Cape region, where we saw was the source actually for the coronavirus South African variant. And at least there's one theory that it may be exactly the circumstances that an immunocompromised individual who's not able to eliminate the virus would become chronically infected for a number of months. And in that setting, the virus would be able to generate a number of these mutations within a single individual, which would explain some of this high mutation rate of some of these variants. So forgetting about the silent epidemics over the years, having neglected that, now may come home to haunt us. The foundation at the outset of the pandemic really pivoted a lot of our work to COVID. And Bill said to me actually early on, a lot of the work we've done on these epidemics of malaria, TB, HIV, undernutrition has really enabled us to develop the partnerships and some of the systems that could be useful in the context of the pandemic. Also, the thinking that went into what could happen after Ebola, where at least there was some thought about a global pandemic, although I'd say there was not the action that we required. So we really jumped in trying to help the various efforts and see what accelerations might be possible. Some of our legacy investments actually turned out to be quite important over here. We've been fascinated by the potential for mRNA delivered antigens in the global health space because of their potential flexibility and immunogenicity, as we've seen at least preclinically. And I would say this has been a fascination of at least 10 years, but we had significant partnerships with BioNTech, CureVac, and Moderna, all who've become important players in the vaccine space against COVID. This is a picture of Ugur Sahin, the CEO of BioNTech, and it's taken from a meeting that we convened in Berlin in 2018 called our Grand Challenges in Global Health. And Ugur was one of the keynote speakers, and he gave a very well-received talk about BioNTech, but he talked actually mostly about the oncology applications of mRNA. And right at the end of the talk, I think you can probably find it online, he said, well, there is the potential application to infectious disease. So imagine that there was a pandemic then I think the mRNA would be the flexible technology that we could deploy in that setting. So very prescient comments from Hugo, which really came true at the end of the day. And of course, we know what that resulted in, this remarkable compression of time. I can hardly look at this more and be so impressed, because knowing all the complexities of getting a new product out there, that's particularly one that's going to be in hundreds of millions of people, is such an enormous challenge. And this compression to within 1 year, it's something that we could spend years and years deconstructing. How can we do that now for the other pressing problems and maybe some of those silent epidemics that I mentioned? We've committed 1.75 billion so far to the fight against COVID, in addition to the funding of our usual programs. And I would say out of that large number, I'm probably proudest of the first 5 million investment we made, which was in February of 2020, very early on. And that was to the Africa CDC. And as it was not clear exactly where this was going to go, and there was some concern that Africa might be disproportionately impacted. That was not the case initially, although now we may be seeing the spread of the variant there. We were able to make an early grant to the Africa CDC that used it to actually line up the national public health institutes of key countries, have meetings with them, have training on diagnostics, start to distribute PCR diagnostics. So what you saw actually in Africa was a very orderly conduct of the early management of the pandemic, also in terms of the lockdowns that occurred, what should be done, what should not be done. That was really much more organized than I think it might have been. And I think that early, small but significant funding was really something that I found was very satisfying in terms of the consequences. Well, how about this back to the future? It can't be the case that when we've really gotten on top of this current problem, we then say, well, let's go back to February 2020 and we'll pick up where we were with the global health issues. And all the things that have happened, if we can just flip through the next few slides, which build this thing, the massive scale up that occurred so quickly, the funding at the levels of tens of billions that poured into research from BARDA, from governments, and I think is still going to be put out there, that enabled this, the regulatory flexibility to be able to call up a regulator and have a ongoing discussion, dialogue with them and settle a protocol in a matter of days is remarkable. And then the vaccines, which were deployed so quickly, which continue to amaze us. So how are we going to capitalize on these extraordinary events which occurred? So let's just think through some of the things that we want to be in place and that are part of this future. And I think which we should insist on, and we can't return to the past. So we should have this accelerated, modular, and distributed vaccine production capacity. You've seen that having vaccines made in just one or two places leads to all kinds of problems in terms of the fair allocation. And this would apply to drug manufacturing as well. There is very little vaccine manufacturing on the African continent. Basically, there's a yellow fever vaccine, which is de novo produced in Senegal. Otherwise, there's some fill finish, but there's not a lot of actual vaccine production. We've been investing in modular units, which have got the ability to be deployed quite broadly at low capital investment costs and low operating costs, which I think are going to be part of that puzzle, to have this defined capacity, particularly for lower middle income countries, that whatever happens, we can supply vaccines in such a crisis. What about surveillance? A couple of months ago in GISAID, when you looked at the sequences, when there were 360,000 COVID sequences in GISAID, 5,600 came from Africa. And that is an unacceptable circumstance. We have invested in a 20-node network here of surveillance sites that are going to have capabilities to do much, much accelerated. I want to see 10x sequencing of pathogens for coronavirus, but it's going to be a broader set of pathogens in Africa at least. And we've had a good partnership with Illumina on providing the reagents and the tools that you need, the basic infrastructure that you need, which is also being deficient. So this is a circumstance which needs to be completely different. How would we know about the rise of the variants? And is this a chance to get some of those digital frameworks for health that we've been talking about for ages? In India, and this is an example, the government, as well as some private entities, private philanthropic entities, have developed a very nice system for digitally indicating and regulating how you get vaccinated, and then producing a certificate that you've been vaccinated, which can be used broadly. Actually, it's much in advance of some of the systems that have been deployed elsewhere, and we are working on how this can be available more broadly, this great digital framework. But embedded in this is the seeds of an electronic health record, because in order to allocate you appropriately by priority for vaccination, the system has to collect some of your background and health data. So as small as that is, this has been the issues around how do we manage the rights and the privacy rights. And all of that is now built into the system. So we see this as the nascent digital framework for effectively an electronic health record and a digital health system. And what about point of care diagnostics? For so long, we've always wished that we would be able to have these flexible diagnostics and accurate diagnostics that could be performed really at point of care, because we don't have the hospital infrastructure in many countries, low infrastructure countries, where we can actually bring people to hospitals or sophisticated clinics. And eventually we've seen traction on this. These boxes over here are one of the devices. It's the Lumira point of care device. And this has the utility that it's an antigen-based test, but it literally is almost as good as the PCR in terms of its sensitivity specificity, if you look at the numbers. So it really is an excellent antigen-based test. And as much as we looked at this as covering a lot of global health, primary healthcare kinds of tests, it's now being developed for COVID and being deployed for that purpose. We have the initial 5,000 devices that are going in, but we have an agreement around putting 70,000 of these devices into clinics around and hospitals around Africa by the end of 2022, which probably puts us ahead by 3 to 4 years, maybe longer, around the projections of having this capacity actually available. And it's not just that it's a test, it's this test, the actual test strip itself is a type of photographic film that you can print literally in the hundreds of millions, which has always been the bottleneck on the existing point of care devices. You just couldn't make enough at the cost point that was useful in many of these countries. And one of the stories of COVID that I think is something that is really touching, and I think is an unknown, but is going to be something important for us for a long time in the future, is around something as simple as the provision of oxygen. We and others have had programs around improving the oxygen supply, particularly for premature infants and other sick infants in countries, particularly in Africa, where there's very poor, inconsistent oxygen supply, just at the central hospitals. And even that is often very inconsistent. And I would say up until a year ago, we had very little traction and very little improvement in that supply. Now with COVID, where the provision of oxygen is actually a life-saving intervention, there's been a surge of interest and a surge of supply. And we now start to see real country plans for sustainable oxygen supply for COVID. But when COVID ends, that can be diverted to neonates and infants. And I think this is going to be a lasting good that we're going to extract from the tragedy that has occurred. Well, that brings me to the notion that I have that in the biomedical and social disciplines, global health really brings to you some of the greatest challenges and opportunities. And solving these inequities is one of the challenges of our age. In order to do that, groups like ours need the broadest partnership with all of you. And we're delighted that we've had this partnership with Scripps, which has really strengthened our programs And I'd thank them for putting this convening together, and would then look forward to any questions you might have for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. That was terrific. And what a sweeping vision that we got to see. We do have to be a little sensitive to your time to get on to the next session where you can discuss pandemic preparedness, but maybe I could just ask a couple of questions. So, from the start, Gates Foundation has been talking about global health, and it's been a consistent message for a long time. What are the ways that you've found that the world is now a bit more receptive to the kinds of concerns that you have and the ways that you're dealing with them?
Well, Jamie, I think that the world is now really switched on to the promise of vaccines. And vaccines are a magical intervention for global health. And I don't think there's anybody, well, there may be some, but let's say, I don't think there's really a lot of people who would be against that proposition. And the work that I was, or the evolution of these variant viruses has really caused people to think about parts of the world that they may not have thought about. Those parts of Africa where these could arise, and what are those social issues over there, and what are those economic factors that have led to those populations being so vulnerable. So you see in the media, and I think you see in policymakers, a renewed interest to tackle those problems.
So another thing that occurred to me, we have a lot of resistance to vaccines in the U.S. And I'm curious to know what's the landscape globally in terms of educating populations about safety and efficacy.
That phenomenon is certainly not a US only phenomenon, and we've had resistance. In the polio campaign, there has been a lot of misinformation around HPV vaccines as well. There's been misinformation, and we've had to deal with that. And I think that what we've seen is that one has to understand the local circumstances. Say for polio, we've had to work with local religious leaders who've explained to populations in northern Nigeria about the advantages of vaccination, and even had the vaccination themselves. So you really need to work within cultures and provide the education and understanding, and get the trusted influencers to buy into the program. So it's not something that comes for free. We shouldn't take it for granted. Everybody's going to want a vaccine. So we have to work at it.
Very good. Trevor, thanks for your inspirational keynote. And I would encourage everyone to now switch over and join in the discussion about pandemic preparedness. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jimmy.